Hey everyone, Jack here, TalkNorwichCity. I hope you're doing well. The interview we've all been hoping for and waiting for has been released. Stuart Webber discussing the season just gone, the plans going forwards for Norwich City Football Club, and his general reflections on the past year. Really fascinating, half an hour long, released on Norwich City's media channels, and of course everyone has had something to say about it, rightly so. So I thought, why not give my thoughts on it? Because I've been critical of Stuart Webber throughout this season, and he is right to a response to all of the criticisms, not just from myself, but made by others. And let's go through it. I think it's really telling when we start here that it's been an in-house interview. If they were going to pick one person to do it, I think Alice Piper's a really good pick. I think she's a canny operator, and I must say her line of questioning at times was quite punchy. So in terms of personnel to do it, I think they've made a good selection there. But it's less so about the questioning in its isolation. It's more of the tone that this sets. Now, I was waiting for a Stuart Webber interview to be released by the club today, and then in the coming days we'd see interviews with the EDP, Radio Norfolk, The Athletic, etc. But what we've actually seen from the EDP and Rob Butler and Chris Gorham, that they have requested multiple times to speak to Stuart Webber for the good of their audience, and they have been turned down on every occasion, including recently. Now that sets a truly terrible message, because during this interview, Stuart Webber said, and he said on multiple occasions, that they don't just speak when it's going well, but also when it's going bad. Well, that's not true, because literally they are not speaking to local press. Now, Stuart would argue that, well, he's done his interview with the club, he doesn't need to do it with the local media, and I get the point. But what we have now here is an interview constructed of pre-written questions that would have been put past Stuart so he could prepare and he could answer in a very secure environment. Now, another of the worries here is the fact that this was filmed on Monday, it's been released on a Thursday, so they've been sitting on this for a few days, and yet there's still some absolute car crash answers regarding the fans. And it's just, for me, my overriding feeling coming out of that half an hour is he said a lot, but not actually answered any real kind of damning questions. And it just feels really muddled. Within the first 2 minutes, he's saying that the fans gave up, which is not the best thing to say. And maybe that was taken out of context slightly, but he said it, and if he wasn't happy with what he said, the club have had time to edit it out, and they haven't. And then he goes on 15 minutes later praising the support at Leicester in midweek and season tickets selling out, etc. So from the off, this feels muddled, it feels confused, and that is the impression I've had from the football club throughout this season. What are we? What's our identity? I keep hearing this self-funded model being bandied about. What does that mean anymore? Is that what we are? Or are we trying to strive for Premier League survival? Because we spent significant money in the summer, 60 odd million quid. That sets one impression, and then we're getting other things. That's confusing. The other thing I'm getting in the first 5 minutes is excuses. I'm hearing about the pre-season going wrong, COVID cases, cancelled trips to Germany, turning up to Newcastle with players playing that hadn't featured in any of the pre-season. All clubs would have been faced with issues surrounding COVID and issues around that. To open up and not take any responsibility is worrying for me. The other thing I keep getting is a real disrespect towards certain fan groups. Not once, not twice, I think 3 times the phrase 20 fans with a bedsheet was mentioned, assuming he was referring to certain demonstrations, not only towards Stuart and his tenure as sporting director, but also the ownership. Now, yes, some of the protests haven't been the most well attended, but don't think that they're the only people thinking that. He said it's been an overwhelming, when he goes into the street, it's an overwhelming sense of positivity. I would disagree with that. I have spoken to multiple Norwich fans of all different spectrums, some uber positive, some uber negative in the best of times, who have all had a fairly common theme with their opinion that this season has been a cataclysmic disaster from top to bottom. So I think it's disrespectful to isolate certain fans because they are making their opinions heard in slightly different ways. That's not the impression I've got. And it's also a really dangerous barometer to be saying, well, it seems like everyone's still behind us because they've renewed their season tickets. Well, let's not forget here that Norwich City fans basically sold out season ticket allocations in League One. Football fans will continue to return to their football club, even if they are in the lowest of lows. That's what being a football fan's about. I will renew my season ticket for the rest of time, whether we've just won the Premier League or we've just been relegated to League Two. It's more than that. That feels like a really easy get out, and that worries me that we're basing, or Stuart and his board are basing fan opinion based off of season ticket sales. That feels very shallow, and that worries me. It was really interesting to hear Stuart speak about the summer business as well, because arguably that is the crux of all of this. This is why we haven't succeeded this season. Money was wasted in the summer, and it felt as if he was kind of defending some of the signings. Now, I do understand that we are purchasing in a select bit of the market where you are naturally taking risks. £10 million 5 years ago is a lot different to what £10 million gets you nowadays. I understand that some of those signings either won't work at all, won't work this season, or don't give you the necessary improvement for Norwich to be competitive in the Premier League. What we've actually seen is realistically none of those signings working this season. Now, I'm going to exclude Dimi Yanulis and Ben Gibson out of that because they were loan deals made permanent. Out of the rest of those players, and you've got some big signings in there in terms of finances for Norwich City: Josh Sargent, Milo Rashica, Christos Jolis, extortionate loan fees for Ozan Kabak, Matthias Norman can be added to that list. Realistically, none of those work. Now, I'm not saying they won't work longer term, but for what we needed this season, they did not work. And I think Stuart glossed over that. The recruitment was poor. Worse than poor. It was terrible. None of those players necessarily made an impact. None of those players were really even starting under Dean Smith. And when we needed improvement off the bench, it was never a Christos Jolis that was looked at. We're suddenly looking at Tony Springett and Jonathan Rowe, which says something in itself that youth players for Norwich, and I'm not saying that these are bad players, I've been impressed with bits of Rowe and Springett that I've seen, are voted over a £10 million player in Christos Jolis or a player that's made international appearances in Josh Sargent. That feels like a worry, and it feels, if we're constantly banding about the self-funding model, we need to take real ownership of the money that we've wasted, because that's an incredibly irresponsible use of cash. I would almost rather us sign half the amount of players for the same amount of money and hope that they had worked. That feels dangerous. It feels as if we're in a situation at the football club where, as I mentioned earlier, we're muddled in what we are. We've lost somewhat of our identity. And it feels as if we have a board surrounded by yes people who will just nod and say yes. There were so many parts of that interview where I've looked at and gone, if we had people around Stuart with strong minds and a willingness to stand up for what they believe in, some of those answers wouldn't have got out. I think on the flip side, I can already see certain comments from certain people saying, well, Jack, what did you expect Stuart to say? What would he have said that would make you happy? And that is a fair argument. I think anything Stuart would have said in this interview, there would have been criticism for. And I understand the difficult position that he's in when it comes to these interviews, because everyone's looking for something to pick into. But that's our own making here. As well as that, I think certain expectations around recruitment wouldn't have been there if there weren't certain comments pre-season around, well, we're sending Daniel Farke to war with a gun and a bazooka and a tank. And I know that some of those comments are slightly tongue-in-cheek, but there was a genuine belief from the top brass at Norwich City that the players that they signed this summer were good enough to compete. And that hasn't happened. We weren't competitive. We had a half-decent spell through November, I think, and what was it, a 5-game unbeaten run when Dean Smith first came to the club. But realistically, none of the performances were astonishing. The win against Southampton was down to 2 goalkeeping errors. The win away to Brentford, we clung on desperately for the final half an hour of that game. The Burnley win at home later on in the season, we were already dead and buried. The majority of wins almost fell into our lap. It was the opposition's wrongdoing rather than us blowing teams away. But with all of this being said, what do? We're operating in a division that is just not sustainable for a club like us to really give it a go. I think you look at Brentford and you look at the Sheffield Uniteds of the past and the Huddersfields, as Stuart mentioned. I do get that point. Yes, first season up is easier to survive than it is in the second season. And often we will see these clubs come straight back down in the second season. I would agree that financially we are safeguarding ourselves for the future. I think the clear development in the infrastructure around the football club has improved. I think he will leave this football club in a better place in terms of infrastructure. But actually, when it comes to on-the-pitch competitiveness, there has been no improvement. We were the same under previous regimes, under previous managers. That hasn't seen an improvement. It's almost regressed. And we're now in a position where we're going back to the Championship. And people keep asking me, and they're saying, Jack, how do you think you'll fare in the Championship? I think we'll be okay. I genuinely do. And I think suddenly that the pressure eases somewhat if we get back into the Premier League. And I think the scrutiny around Stuart Webber lessens because you're suddenly winning football matches. And I would agree with Stuart Webber that I think the squad does look strong from a Championship level. He mentioned the likes of Cantwell and Sinani, Sam McCallum, Onel Hernandez, Jordan Hugill all returning. They are all players who I think are of a fairly decent Championship standard and hopefully will feature. And you've, of course, got the ones you're retaining from the Premier League to compete at that level as well. So I think there is opportunity in the Championship. The problem is this then resurfaces if we were to go back up. What do we do next time in the Premier League? We knew that Daniel Farke wasn't up to Premier League standard, and that's been proven by the fact that Dean Smith's had a fairly torrid run with a squad that isn't his and still has bettered Daniel Farke's win percentage. Not that that was a particularly difficult feat, but it's now got to the stage where is Stuart Webber out of his depth in the Premier League, or at least is the infrastructure around Stuart Webber strong enough for the Premier League? I have said multiple times, a huge worry for me is the sheer amount of staff that have left the football club. And I understand football is an industry in which staff turnover is high, but they're not being replaced. You can see it all across the company. People leaving, not being replaced, or people are leaving and being replaced by those who maybe aren't quite as good at their jobs. And that's not a dig at anyone but those constructing these teams, because then what you get, particularly in these instances, is a confused identity. No one is really pulling in the same direction. That's what I'm seeing. That's what I'm inferring from these interviews. I think the most damning insight into all of this is the fact that local media haven't been allowed to prod Stuart Webber themselves. Because yes, the interview was fine. It left me wanting more. I watched the half an hour and kind of got to the end of it and gone, well, I knew all that already. And maybe it would have been the same if Radio Norfolk or The Pink 'Un or Michael Bailey had done one of these interviews. But at least they could have expanded on certain answers, on certain questions, and really dug deeper. The interview was fine, but it left me no wiser and no more confident in the future of this football club. And I think they're treading a very dangerous line if they continue to not give local press the opportunity to question Stuart Webber. That's my thoughts. I'd love to hear yours. If you haven't watched it, give it a watch and let me know. Do you think I'm fair, or do you think I'm overstepping the mark here? I will once again reiterate, as I have said in multiple videos before, that I think on his day, Stuart Webber is a very shrewd man, clearly knows what he's doing. We just need to get that best out of him again. It feels as if we've gone slightly wayward over the past season. Certain PR disasters, and that worries me as well, because I'm led to believe that we're paying some consultants some fairly punchy cash to help with this, and it's not working. We're making the same mistakes over and over again. There we go. They're my thoughts on Stuart Webber's interview. I'd love to hear yours down in the comments section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all again very soon. Bye-bye.